This is, as in so many of the things I've discovered, an object lesson in the phenomenon of unintended consequences, whereas, busy little modifiers of our environment, we go out and change something and we don't realize all the kind of cascade of consequences that come along and follow that. And this is one where it's very, very obvious what happened. What's obvious that something happened, but what's not so obvious is why it happened. So we have these two sunken settlements in Lake St. Clair, which we've been giving some attention lately. And so what I'm going to try and do is contextualize this in a fairly long-term historical frame. First, though, the geographical frame is, Lake St. Clair. It's a very shallow lake. Its average depth is about 18 feet. Compared with the other Great Lakes, which can be measured in hundreds of feet. It's just a wide spot in the river, which is what the early cartographers tended to call it. And being so shallow, its shoreline is rather dynamic. It doesn't take too much water, plus or minus, to either run further inland or to make for those wide beaches. And so over time, a couple of settlements kind of fell victim to this. In the early 1800s, the two small settlements that we're talking about on the west shore of the lake were called Belvedere Village, which was located up in Anchor Bay, and also St. Felicity Parish in L'Anse Creuse down the shoreline a bit. By mid-century, this is the mid-1800s, 1830s, they both began to submerge, and that submergence turned out to be permanent. And so as an archaeologist, as a historian, I want to figure out why that might have happened. Was it something that just a natural phenomenon, or was it something that we did? We're getting pretty busy in that area at that time, or could it be a combination of the two, which is a kind of a big hint. So as I say, to get the context of all of this, I always feel it best to turn the dial back a little bit time-wise and see what the indigenous period might have looked like. And so to study a very dynamic shoreline during the pre-European contact period, I really homed in on the St. Clair Flats, which is the distinctive feature of the water system around here. We have the world's largest freshwater delta out there at the foot of the St. Clair River, the head of the lake. It has natural habitat for flora and fauna. So to the indigenous peoples, this would provide them literally food, clothing, and shelter. Wild rice literally grows wild there. Manomen is not only a source of food, but it also exists in reed beds, which had the tendency to absorb wave action and erosive forces. And so it's protecting that shoreline, keeping it from changing too much. They found the species of trees and plants in the area that they needed to make their canoes, the birch for the bark, the cedar and spruce for the framing. Everything was there for them to create the watercraft that made them a great maritime people who could voyage from the head of Lake Superior, literally to the Atlantic seaboard. They also had, fish, waterfowl, game, beaver, everything they needed for their own personal food needs, but also once the beaver trade came along, that became a rich source of revenue for them, where they were able to trade, beaver pelts for trade goods. And so everything in terms of the indigenous population, pre-European contact, this was heaven on earth. So when Cadillac moved his headquarters from Michilimackinac down to Fort Detroit, to Detroit, built Fort Pontchartrain. He brought along his trading partners with him, and there were four principal trading partners once things settled down a bit. Those were the Odawa, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Wyandot. And the three of those, the Wyandot, the Ojibwe, or the Wyandot, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, settled in the area of Fort Detroit. The Potawatomi in particular were great farmers, as were the Wyandot, and so they took up horticulture in an area where they had been farming for centuries before the outbreak of the Iroquois Wars decimated this area. But the Ojibwe, and actually it was their cousins, the Mississauga, who moved down here first, they weren't originally from this area. They weren't reclaiming their ancestral homeland. They were from the north shore of Lake Huron. Their name, Mississauga, means people of the mouth of the river. And so they settled in a place that more closely resembled home. If you look at the two sets of circles here, you can see that the big circle around Fort Detroit has the fort and 3 of the villages. But over here in this other circle, you can see Les Mississauga. That's where they settled at the mouth of the river. So they became kind of the magnet for their Ojibwe cousins as they moved down here. They named their land Bekejwanong, which is the Anishinaabemowin term for where the waters divide. So it's where the St. Clair River split up into the multiple channels, the north, the south, middle channel, Snai-Bora, Snai-Cardi, all of these channels dissipated the force of the river and led to the formation of the delta. And so what you've got is kind of reminiscent to them of their homeland at the mouth of the river. When the French come along, they want to practice colonial navigation in their own typical way. They come across the Atlantic, after all, on ships. And so LaSalle's experiment was the Griffin, 1679, which was built above the Niagara Escarpment. All of the hardware and so on were shipped over from France. The fittings, the canvas, the ropes, and so on were all made in Europe. And that's really the manufactured payload. But then above the Niagara, they felled the trees that they needed. And here you see this kind of conjectural etching or engraving of some kind, picturing what it might have looked like as the Native Americans are over here observing the French building this big boat of theirs. Of course, we know that the Griffin sank somewhere up in probably in northwestern Lake Michigan, but really its trouble started almost immediately. After they had crossed Lake Erie, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, they tried to get through that delta. And Louis Hennepin, the chronicler and the missionary aboard LaSalle's Griffin, described in a very brief passage that sums up the problems that people encountered. It's mariners who wanted to sail through this area encountered. There is little depth as you enter and leave Lake St. Clair. Speaking of the delta, there's the discharge from Lake Orleans, which is now Lake Huron, which divides into the small channels, almost all of them barred by sandbanks. As these channels empty out into the river, they decelerate, and all the sand and silt that they're carrying drops out and forms these sandbars. And they had to look around for one that actually had some depth to it. But then finally, the prevailing wind is north, northwest, and so on. And so more often than not, if you're sailing, you've got the wind against you. And so sailing in these really constricted, narrow, blockaded waters against the wind could sometimes cause the sailors to have to wait for days, even weeks, which is actually where Anchor Bay gets its name. It's where they would anchor, waiting for a change in the weather. So everything was against them here. Is that one of the great bottlenecks of the Great Lakes, where elsewhere you could just sail in nice, open, deep water. So there was the problem was already pretty well described as LaSalle passed through here. And of course, there's the fiasco of, I won't say they were chauvinistic, but the French felt that they were great sailors and could handle anything. And against the advice of their native trading partners up in the vicinity of Green Bay, present-day Wisconsin, they went out to bring their cargo back to Montreal in some pretty nasty weather. And we all know how fast things can blow up on the Great Lakes with very little warning. You don't have a big, long horizon like you do on the ocean. And so for one reason or another, and in one place or another, they lost it. So here's this, imaginative painting of what it might have looked like as the natives were loading their bales and bales of furs onto the Griffin, and of course receiving trade goods in exchange. So the French kind of observed the fact that the Native Americans were pretty efficient in moving cargo in a vessel that was much more adapted to the circumstances, not just getting through the delta of Lake St. Clair, but also going up all the rivers where, after all, the beaver were living and where the people were living. So they adopted the canoe for the remainder of the French colonial period until the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s. You had French canoes that looked like this. This is the Canot de Maître. This is the Voyageur canoe, and you can see remarkable representation of how much stuff these things could carry, in addition to all the paddlers and so on. You could carry barrels and barrels of tobacco and whiskey and so on, bales and bales of furs. You can see that red block there. This is Stroud or Stroud. This is the red cloth that was highly prized by their trading partners. And so this went on pretty efficiently for the duration of the French colonial period. They were adapted to the shallows, the currents, the portages. They could get through just about anything. And so the narrows and the delta of St. Clair was just another river to them. When the British come along, however, they want to do it their way, like the French originally did. And so, and I think the British are even more stubborn about this. Britannia rules the waves, is their saying. And so whether it was the Atlantic or the Great Lakes, they were going to use square riggers, schooners, tall ships, basically, to carry larger volumes of cargo. It's true that more of the area was getting settled. There was a higher volume of goods and commodities and materials and people going back and forth. So the first deck vessel, called the Gladwin, ventures out into the Great Lakes. It actually served in the Pontiac's rebellion, the siege of Detroit. It was one of the ships that prevented Pontiac from taking Detroit because they were able to reinforce and relieve the fort from the water. So what developed then was a way of getting through the bottleneck, what I call a hybrid route, where you had to transfer cargo from one type of vessel to another. So there was a vessel called the Victory, a sister ship of the Gladwin. It would come from Niagara to Anchor Bay by way of Lake Erie and up the Detroit River. They'd pick up supplies and so on, exchange goods in Detroit, and then head up into Anchor Bay. From there, they would transfer the cargo to smaller boats. And these would be the French-derived vessels that had been there since the French colonial occupation, the bateaux, pirogues, all these little flat boats. They could take the cargo of the big ships, in a process called lightering, making the ship lighter, get it across the hump there in the delta, and then transfer it to a second schooner, the Gladwin, which would sail from Fort Sinclair, which is the present site of the village of St. Clair, Michigan, all the way up to Mackinac and through the straits and over to La Baye, Green Bay. So they did manage to sail deep water technique and vessels most of the time, but the bottleneck was still there at the St. Clair Delta. So we can take a look then at the shorelines that develop under French and under British domination. And of course, it's really all about not just the depth of the water you can sail through, but what do you do when you want to pick up or drop things off on land? The launches and landings or transfer points for people and cargo. And so French had long used this decentralized system called the ribbon farm, which I'm sure you are all even more familiar with than I. But the virtue of it was that you didn't need to have any improved infrastructure. You didn't have to build a wharf or a pier. And if you're using a flat bottom boat, whether it's a pirogue or a bateau or a canoe, you can beach it right on land and your payload and your people can get off and on right there. So everybody had to have frontage. So the ribbon farm took its shape very, very pragmatically from the fact that you needed at least a narrow frontage, but then you could go back as far as you like, which had the virtue of creating several growing zones. Actually, they would tend to have along the beach, you'd have row crops and so on, whereas farther toward the back, you might have fruit orchards and so on. So you have various growing zones in your own little strip. So there's an example of the ribbon farm there. Whereas the British, they wanted to exchange things in bulk. The big ships couldn't run themselves onto the beach. And so at places like Fort Detroit or at Fort Sinclair, they would build wharves. And we have this wonderful painting here from the very end of the British occupation in Detroit. This is in 1796. A British lieutenant of artillery named Edmund Henn painted this remarkably detailed study. It was in the collection of Lady Astor, who, when she learned that it was a depiction of Fort Detroit, gave it to the Detroit Public Library. Is now in the Burton collection down at the main branch of DPL. And here you can see several things going on. Both on the map and in the painting, I have arrows pointing to the King's Wharf. This was the royal structure where the square riggers could on and offload cargo, and there was also warehouses right there on the wharf and on shore. So this is the infrastructure they built for their deep water navigation. But side by side with this, you've got here the little bouncing rectangle there is outlining the more traditional French shoreline method, where you can see the canoes and all in the foreground, the bateaus coming and going. You can see there's a little pony cart there where they're offloading cargo, much smaller quantities, much closer to shoreline with much less demand on the infrastructure. And you can see there's a little path, little S-shaped path wending its way up to a blockhouse at the corner of Fort Pontchartrain. And so this is the system that was able to interface with the deep water navigation of the British. So the two systems side by side were that hybrid transfer system that I spoke of. Now, what the British really needed to sail safely in deep water and to find where the safe places to launch and land were, they really needed more accurate surveys. If you look at French mapping of the time, they show the rivers in great detail, but not necessarily to scale and not necessarily in the right position. I consider the French mapping to be more like a schematic diagram that, you know, you could go down the shoreline and one by one you could count off the rivers you went by. The British wanted to know where the shoal water was, where the deep water was, and so they really put teams in the field to establish this. And the first place they wanted to establish it was in the problematic waters around the St. Clair Delta. And so right after they take over at the end of the French and Indian War, the commander at Detroit, Lieutenant Dedrick Brem, goes up the shoreline of the St. Clair Delta there and maps this western shoreline pretty well, but on the eastern present-day Canadian side, he literally gets lost. This is a quotation from his report saying, Lake St. Clair, the upper end of it, is drowned land or islands of rush and canes and swamps, which is, of course, what the indigenous people found so useful and practical. So he could hardly find his way around. He got lost. It's in beds of rushes, and this was in the late fall, November of 1761, and so he had to go back and find a way to retrace his steps. They kept trying it, and the next year, his colleague, Lieutenant Robinson, was able to do a pretty good survey of that western shoreline only. In 1763, he went back to try and do it again. Unfortunately for him, while he was out in the field, Pontiac besieged Detroit, and on attempting to return, his party was ambushed by Pontiac's troops, and there were few survivors. Actually, one of whom was adopted by the Odawa, Pontiac's tribe, and returned years later as pretty much a naturalized Odawa citizen. Well, here's the sketch that Robinson made of Lake St. Clair in 1762, and you can see that there's a fair amount of detail on the left-hand side there, the west side, and soundings. He actually was going through there with a lead line, finding out where the deep water was. So a really professional job given his means. But then if you can read it, over on the right-hand side, it says, a deep bay of rushes as far as can be seen. Now, I can, just on the basis of this map, I can find modern day features that we still use: Belle Isle, the Clinton River, Bouvier Bay, Point au Tremble. All these are easily identified. The North Channel, the Middle Channel, they're all there. Whereas, and the notorious elbow, yes, this was a sharp bend. I'm going to try this with my cursor here. If you can see this sharp bend in the river, this is the natural channel of the original river back when it was much lower and still cutting its banks. This was what you had to navigate if you wanted to get into the North Channel and ultimately in the area of Algonac here up into the main channel of the St. Clair River. Finding that and keeping it marked was actually the key for nearly 100 years. But on the eastern shoreline, that deep Bay of Rushes, or what we would have called in those days terra incognita, unknown land. It's where you paint pictures of, I don't know, dragons and so on over there, where you really didn't know quite what was going on. All they knew is it was no good for navigation, so it kind of stayed off their charts from there on for a while. So what we've got then is the St. Clair Flats forming the great bottleneck of the upper Great Lakes. I mean, there are a few places where navigation is difficult. The first and most obvious one, of course, was Niagara Falls. Until the Welland and Erie canals were dug, that was pretty much of a deal breaker. But then once they got above that, if you got past St. Clair Flats, you had a couple of other things waiting for you. Mackinac Straits can be problematic, but it's navigable. And the other one was the Sault Ste. Marie, the falls of the St. Mary's River, to get from Lake Huron up into Lake Superior. So this was one of the things that really, really limited their ability to sail deep water. So what they did as an adaptation to this was to wait in Anchor Bay for that lightening process, where they would put the cargo on lighter vessels. And if the vessel, actually the ship, became light enough, it could glide over the sandbars there. And what the British noticed, and in talking with the Native Americans learned, was that the water level was liable to vary. Some years you have high water. If anybody lives on Lake St. Clair, they know that you have seasons, but especially high water and low water years. And so this became a documented feature, and the place to wait for better water. Sometimes just with a southerly breeze would push enough water up into Anchor Bay that you could sail through this area without even lightering your vessel. So timing, as they say, is everything. Well, in the long time frame, you can record these variances in the depth of Lake St. Clair and also in Lake Erie. Unfortunately, Lake Erie was measured back to the 1900s, and then projected by tree ring data to a time period even earlier than that. So if you see here that the high and low water marks of Lake Erie tend to vary between 571 feet above sea level to 576, so about a 5-6 foot range. That's pretty considerable if you're trying to sail through a 6-foot channel. It could be 12 feet if you wait enough. Well, Lake St. Clair historically co-varies with Lake Erie. So we know that if there's a chart for Lake Erie, chart for Lake St. Clair will be essentially a mirror image of it, just about 5 feet higher. That's about all the extent of the drop that occurs between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie. So the Detroit River is a very gently descending stream. Well, some scientists up in the North Shore of Alaska were looking at tree rings and the way that they reflected the amount of water and seasonality and so on of the snowpack that went into the Canadian Shield and then down into the Great Lakes drainage. And they found that they could actually model the Lake Erie water levels back into a prehistoric period by looking at the tree rings. And so they built a model that agreed nicely with the historical data and then projected it back. So you can see here, this purple line on the graph is a reconstructed Lake Erie water level, where you can see those fluctuations go back, and they can be times very dramatic. One of the low spots is around 1800, you can see, and in the mid 18th century, there's a pretty steep climb where it's staying above average for years and years on end. And we'll see that that's very closely related to the histories of Belvedere Village and St. Felicity Parish. Another cool thing that we'll be coming back to before I talk about the anecdotal support, that little bouncing ring there came in, and you can see it's around a time period that looks like it's around 1930. We're going to see that again. But observers in the field, people who were sailing and surveying and so on, were observing in the early 18th century this trend. In 1820, the water's pretty low. David Bates Douglas, who accompanied Lewis Cass on his first voyage of expedition, which he used canoes on, by the way, up to the headwaters of the Mississippi and so on. He was a civil engineer, and he observed of Lake St. Clair that it was a mere dilation of the river, very shallow, except in those certain channels, and that they were paddling in canoes, so they many miles from shore, they could still stick their paddles in the mud because the shoreline was so shallow, and the rushes were stabilizing it and keeping it that way by growing so thick. So that's an anecdote from 1820. A decade later, it's still pretty much that situation. We've got he's a clergyman, either a clergyman or an attorney, I think. Calvin Colton left us oh yes, the Reverend Calvin Colton left us his journal of his travels. And again, he says the same thing as Douglas did. A flooding of the lowlands, the water is low, ships are being grounded in the St. Clair Flats, and it's a big obstruction to the navigation between Erie and Huron. Well, things are starting to change in the following decade. We've got a wonderful author named Eliza Steele, who was a prolific writer and had a good eye for detail and for dialogue. And she would talk to the locals and pick up on their local knowledge. One of the things that she relays is this cyclic variation that kind of echoes what we heard coming from the map maker back in a couple of decades earlier, the cyclic variation. And the question is, okay, but what's the cycle? And there's some disagreement as to whether or not it's every 7 years, as the Native Americans averred, and a geologist, a scientific traveler, as she calls him, named Darby, who says that there is a rise once in 50 years. And of course, these can both be true. We know about cycles of climatic change and so on that can coincide, where they either reinforce each other so things get even deeper, or they can kind of maybe cancel each other out and prevent a great deal of change. And so timing, as I say, is everything. And what we find is that by the 1850s, not only is the water starting to rise a bit, but man now is taking a role in the park. By the 1850s, we have developed steam power, not only for propulsion. Not only are there steam boats all over the Great Lakes, but now the needs of greater water depth and greater and wider channels and so on have led to the development of the steam-powered dredge. It was developed actually in Wisconsin to help dredge harbors and so on, and the commercial shippers in the area very quickly got their hands on a couple of them. The Army Corps of Engineers was taking on more of a role, less as mapping the environment and more a role of shaping the environment. So what used to be called the topographical engineers, where they were just out making surveys like this, now they're active. So the bottleneck is, again, that elbow. You can see it's as little as 5 feet. By 1848, there's our steam dredge, patented by Abel Hawley. And by 1855, they had managed to dredge a channel about 60 feet wide and 13 feet deep, which is easily double what the natural depth was at the mouth of the South Channel, which shows up on this little chart as point A. They actually had weighed 2 options. One was point B, kind of to head west-northwest out into the lake and straighten it out a bit, and A, which was to take a bit of a more of a turn, frankly, but to dredge a shorter distance out into the lake. At any rate, that's the one that won. And now the next thing to keep people in the channel was to mark it. And so if you're familiar with Lake St. Clair, if you've been up near Anchor Bay, you're familiar with the old South Channel lights. These marked a range, 2 marks that once you lined them up, you were on track to enter that channel and be able to sail it there following beacons and buoys. So there's those 2 range lights there. And so the route became line them up. And as soon as you come to the first one, take a right, basically head east. And then when you see the buoys, then start following it up the natural channel of the South Channel of St. Clair River. A few years later, by 1871, they said, you know, that dog leg is making things a little more complicated, they realized that straighter is better. And so they dredged the St. Clair Flats Ship Canal, which you see is the green path number B there, which did straighten it up quite a bit and made the old South Channel lights basically kind of a remnant of the first generation of our engineering our environment, building our landscape. So the unintended consequences, well, what it turned out is that when you make a bigger, wider, deeper, straighter channel from the river into the lake, more water is able to flow in. But until 1874, they didn't do anything to widen the river as it goes down through and into the Detroit River. That was much less problematic, and so it didn't get as much attention. But as they started building bigger and bigger ships, they realized that at a place called Lime Kiln Crossing, that they had another kind of hump that the bigger, deeper ships were starting to hit, and so they dredged that. But by that time, the flow of water through St. Clair River and Lake St. Clair had reached this new equilibrium, and it was about 3 to 5 feet higher than the natural one. And that's what kind of spelled the doom of our little settlements there. Deepening the channel also deepened the lakes. That's the unintended consequence. Now, in one sense, that's good because you've got a deeper channel all the way through Lake St. Clair, but the bad news is there were victims. So taking a look at St. Felicity at L'Anse Creuse, its history was there was a little church built there in 1826. By 1829, they actually had lost some parishioners, including, I think, at least one of the priests, and there is a cemetery there. Now, this is a little model that was built by a priest, historian, archivist for the Archdiocese of Detroit. So this is conjectural, but it's probably fairly accurate. And just note that the structure is very small. It's undoubtedly made of natural materials. Remember, we're in an area that's still heavily forested. Michigan has got tons and tons of trees, not many rocks or bricks or anything like that. So you're going to use available materials, perishable available materials. Let's remember. The congregation was descendant French. You'll love that if there are any Chauvins or Marsacs or Leducs or Duchesnes or Lorrains or Griffards or Petits or Duchesnes or Lapierres out there. This is your ancestral farms. All those little strip ribbon farms were the parishioners. One of them, Paul Rattel, donated a portion of it, and I think also Leduc, yeah, Leduc, Duchesne, Lorraine. They allowed the archdiocese, the diocese, I'm sure at that time, to build a church right on the beach. The reason for that being, of course, that real estate, while it's long, is narrow, and the zones are kind of prime real estate. You didn't want to, build your church in a place that could produce vineyards, orchards, row crops, grain, that sort of thing. And so it was on the shoreline. The access was going to be by boat. There was no road behind this anyway, so the parishioners could come and go to the shoreline where they would find the church because of the valuable interior. But that means that the first thing that's going to go underwater is this church. So by 1836, they're already seeing high water cycles where it's flooded. And between 1836 and 1855, it was flooding regularly. And by 1869, the site is permanently submerged. And here you can see a projection of the earlier. Let's go back. This is one of the earlier maps that shows the shoreline, and I think you can see St. Aubin kind of in the middle of that. I don't know exactly what streets are overlaid on this. I know that there are folks out there who do, but you can see there's a Campo down there, Cottrell. So a lot of these founding Detroit families have got a stake in this area here. Well, as I say, there's the superimposition of modern day aerial photography over those sites. So you can see how much of the shoreline was lost in the process of this flooding. Meanwhile, up in Anchor Bay, the southwest corner of Anchor Bay is Belvedere Bay, and it's named after Belvedere Village, which was this project of a speculator named James Conger. He had planned for this to be the preeminent deep water port on the Great Lakes, is how his promotional literature stated it. It's still going to be kind of shallow there, but one nice thing he had going was the Clinton River was navigable. In fact, at this time, it was kind of the object of a projected canal that would go deep into the interior. At this time, railroads and canals were kind of fighting it out for dominance in long distance haulage and transportation. Ultimately, the railroads won out, but as far as it was improved, which was up to Mount Clemens, you had a nice deep water river, and so you had river traffic interfacing with the big open water laker traffic, and also highways were starting to infiltrate the area, and a spur railroad line, the line that went from Detroit to Saginaw, over to Pontiac, and ultimately over to Lansing. A spur was built out into this area here. So you had a multimodal transportation node, I guess we would call this, where a lot of transshipping of people and goods could take place. So it wasn't a crazy idea, but it was ill-fated, badly timed. So here we are on Anchor Bay, and you can see down here this little area, Belvedere Bay, and it's really along this spit of land here that Conger is projecting his little village. And a fair amount of it got built. He had, there's his multimodal hub, sorry. He built a wharf, again, and this is similar to the Detroit and the St. Clair model. You built something that would stick out into the water so that ships could, big deep water ships could get up close and unload their stuff. But there was a hotel. There were actually two mills. One was a sawmill and the other one was a grist mill. There was a warehouse for transshipping, general store for the residents, 20 houses, and a bank, which issued $3 bills. I would be leery of anyone who, who's offering $3 bills, but that apparently was a number he liked. In 1855, again, that dredging takes place. So that's really the tipping point, literally, for our little settlement there. And again, within a year, it submerges and it's abandoned. Now, I am told that this is a shot of Belvedere Village, and I'm not quite sure how they got this. It might have been from a balloon. I don't think it's from a drone. But what I assume here is, here's a line of telegraph poles. I can totally see that. And coming to this building, and probably some other buildings that were long gone, but this has to be the hotel. It was the last structure standing in the area. And James Conger was the last resident of the hotel. He had to be, well, his family had to stage an intervention. He was living on the second floor and refused to leave. I think he was kind of heartbroken or whatever and losing it. And he was, as they say, removed by his family and ended his days in Columbus, Ohio. I'll leave it to you to decide which is a worse fate. But at any rate, not long after that, the Belvedere is completely submerged and abandoned and so on, and all these structures kind of disappear, or do they? Now, with all that cyclic variation in the depth, and if you remember that little circle I had around the year 1930 when it looked like Lake St. Clair had a really record low water time, a lumber baron by the name of Wallach happened by and saw this lovely island out in Belvedere Bay, and he bought it. And being a lumber baron, he had lots of timber at his disposal, and so he built a home out there. And when the water started to rise, he built a wooden seawall completely surrounding the island. And so that's still there. All this happened during record low water, but as I say, now it is underwater again. This is historical aerial photography. This is just good old Google Earth. If you go back in their timeline, this is one example I found where what's left of the island, this little bit here is peaking its head above water and has some vegetation on it. But if you take a look, I hope you could follow my cursor here. You can see the rectangle, at least three sides of it. The rest of it is about here. This is Wallach's wooden wall here that he built around it. It's still down there. The logs are literally waterlogged. They're not going anywhere. And so you can see how large the island was at its greatest extent. Meanwhile, along the shoreline, those people who had lost, maybe a couple of 100 feet of their shoreline, had retreated and back, but they were also creating structures to take the place of those reed beds that used to absorb the force of the waves. And so these are barges that were intentionally sunk offshore. They're very, very visible from the air and even more visible from the water. They're only in about 3 or 4 feet of water, but their intention is, especially high water, is to absorb the force of the waves. That the breakers, the whitecaps and so on, will break out here and not be as destructive when they get inland here, where you can see there are little docks, but seawall, hard seawall, sheet pile protecting the shoreline. So the sunken stories, we get out into the field starting in about 1959. There was a survey that was done actually up in Anchor Bay near Anchorville, which found a good deal of prehistoric settlement. This is ceramics and artifacts going back to the pre-European contact period. Some of them going back about 800-900 years. So this has been, as I say, it's been a paradise on earth for the indigenous inhabitants for centuries. And so they found both kinds of artifacts. Here are some of the colonial era artifacts. You can see here is a cross of Lorraine, which is the popular cross of the French colonial community. So this would indicate, missionary work in the area. Also, the traders would bring the axes, the tomahawk, the combined, the pipe and the tomahawk. This appears to be the blade of a straight razor. And here's jewelry, probably that was made by the indigenous people from articles, sometimes pots and pans that they would trade with the French. But once they had more, 1 or 2 pots and pans, they started cutting them up and making them into these jingle beads and so on that they would use in rituals and dancing and so on. So they were very creative with what they took from the colonists. In the 1960s, a local resident right there who lived on the site of the village found this alabaster statue. It is depicting Our Lady of Sorrows, which is very strong in the French tradition as an object of veneration. Matter of fact, I went to Our Lady of Sorrows school here in Farmington Hills way back in the day, still around. Then 1995, Wayne State came back with a dive team. Father Ruthenberg is the diocesan priest who created that little model that we saw, and they did find some religious artifacts. Again, another cross of Lorraine, which kind of links it to the whole missionary experience, and 3 gravestones. They say gravestones. I think that they may mean grave markers. I'm not entirely sure that they had stone that was adequate or appropriate for constructing gravestones. I suspect that they might have found grave markers that were wooden, that might have been waterlogged, submerged, and so on. I have not been able to trace the whereabouts or verify any of those grave markers. So here we are in 2020. The Macomb County Environment and Recreation Department received a $160,000 grant from, among other things, the Michigan Coastal Zone Management Authority to do a survey of these 2 sites with the aim of making the local history tangible, possibly by putting up historical markers, saying this, marks the site of St. Felicity, Belvedere Village, and telling the story, even though the sites are submerged, taking some of what's local knowledge or archival knowledge or hopefully archaeological record and kind of putting it in storytelling form, promoting heritage tourism, the Blue Water Trail that goes around Lake St. Clair and up into Lake Huron on both the American and Canadian sides, kind of tying in with that, putting out the documentary that aired back in February at Macomb Community Center and the historical markers. So in 2023, after surviving COVID, we actually got out into the field, and our performing partner was the Noble Odyssey Foundation, which has a contract with the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Navy Sea Cadets, who are young people between the ages of 11 and 17 that go out into the field on this this ship there, I should point out there, that's the Pride of Michigan. That is the research vessel that they use. It's a converted Navy patrol boat. It's 81 feet long. It's an ideal, just the right size ship for kids to learn on. They learn to do everything from change the engine filters to cook meals and especially to dive. And so we want to get out into the water and look for stuff. So we do our little due diligence, figuring out where on the map these things would be, logging them into our GPS, and then going out doing our shallow water craft. You can see we've got the big ship back here, and then a 28-foot smaller, cabin cruiser basically. But for this job, we really needed to use the inflatable Zodiacs. So here we are in the dive team and the survey team. I'm up in front running a combination of a GPS and a sonar scanner, where we are looking for the stuff that might be on the sites of the two places. So we found some structure. There's actually one of our volunteers here using a glass bottom bucket before putting the dive team in, so we can see what we're getting onto. We're marking that with a buoy, logging it into the GPS, and then deploying the dive team. So they go in and they are sketching, photographing, doing video, generally documenting what they found. The main thing that we found was stones of the foundation of the Wallach compound from the 1930s and the wall surrounding it. Some of the fasteners, you can see these are some of the bolts that were used to pin the timbers of the seawall together. But again, this stuff is from the 1930s. We had very few archaeological results that can be dated to 1 century earlier. And there's several reasons for that, possibly. So where did the past go? Well, there is a lack of evidence remaining at the sites, no doubt about that. So we have to say, well, why might that be? There are destructive processes that attack our environment. As soon as we turn our back on it, things start to fall apart. Some of those processes are natural. I mean, this is shallow water in the Great Lakes. So we've got several things that are happening. In shallow water, you have a lot of decay. It's not like those deep water wrecks that turn up in 300 and 400 feet of water where they're basically in an ice box down there. Wood, if it's periodically exposed, it's going to oxidize, it's going to rot, break up, and float away. So there's decay. There's also scattering in shallow water. Waves, especially heavy wave action that comes with storms. There are currents that are operating full time to carry things away and put pressure on structures. And of course, there's ice. When you have a heavy ice year, that ice is going to go down 10, 15, 20 inches, and it's going to act like just a bulldozer, or a razor, just scraping everything away. We've also got sediment that's continuing to come down. So if something doesn't get shoved away, it's liable to get buried. There's a little bit of hope in that some of the structures and artifacts, if they're made out of durable materials like stone foundations or hearths or what have you, that those might still be down there. Those metal joints that we're pinning things together, if they're fasteners and so on, used to put timber together, the timber may be gone, but there's still possibility to find things there. Then there's the man-made destructive practices. For one thing, it seems that these communities did submerge gradually. And I think as soon as people realized that the water was coming up and wasn't really going back down anytime soon, that they would salvage and reuse all these things. These are small structures. They're made of components or materials, pre-hung doors, cast iron stoves. Those are going to be salvaged, and they're going to be brought inland and put on higher ground. So anything structural or useful is going to be either recycled, or possibly, if something gets in the way, it's simply going to be an obstruction to navigation. And so if you've got a new seawall and you're on your new cottage and you're back on the high ground and you've got all this stuff that's out there in the water that's basically shearing the prop on your outboard, you're going to find a way to make it go away, either personal agency or the Army Corps of Engineers, which would make sure that channels were cleared for navigation, whether it's the commercial channels out in the middle of the lake or even the recreational channels that go up into the Clinton River. So That given, and now that we've seen what we're up against, the plan is to return next year, 2025. Hopefully we'll get an additional extension on that grant and be able to put the team back in the field. We have a much better idea what we're going to be looking for, where we're going to be looking for it, and what it might, what it might take to find it. So what we see when we look in the big picture, then those shorelines changed over time. And so the shoreline changes from a natural feature to a built environment that features infrastructure like wharves and channels and lighthouses and buoys and so on. Among the things that were tried over the years were wooden retaining walls to keep the channels well defined. Those had a certain life expectancy. The wood would rot, but the wave action and actually the action of the propellers of bigger and bigger steam boats and freighters gradually eroded them. So they were kind of a phase we went through. But here you can see an example of right around the turn of the 20th century where they built a retaining wall right down the center of the St. Clair Ship Canal. This is long gone now. But they tried to treat it like a freeway where you'd have, the upbound and the downbound lane, and you had creosoted timbers, and in the middle you'd use the dredge spoils from the dredging operation. They'd haul them and dump them in between the walls, and planting things. They planted willows and grasses and so on that were supposed to hold the soil. Looked good on paper, but didn't really work. Dredge spoils found themselves in other places, though. They were used to create either artificial islands like Seaway Island, which is mostly on the Canadian side now, and also dumping grounds that they would have off to the side of the dredge channel. So all these circles are surrounding areas where the Corps of Engineers was taking all of its dredging that they used to create and to maintain the deep water channel that runs through here that averages somewhere around 29, 30 feet. Another way of stabilizing the shoreline was to use what's called riprap. Broken concrete in most cases from highway project would be brought along, and it had the virtue of having a kind of a sloping shoreline, so waves, when they crash against it, don't just slam into it. They'd ride up onto it and break on it and then recede less harmfully than a hard shoreline. But more and more what we find are the vertical sheet steel walls made from sheet piling. Here you can see a sheet steel seawall being installed by not a dredge, but I'm trying to think of the term here. Pile driver, I guess, would be what you have here. And so they just drop a weight on and drive them down well below water level. But the problem is that they are foursquare against any wave action. If again you live or have friends who live along the shoreline, a few years ago we had some really high water. This was just taken a few years ago of a brother-in-law who lives on Anchor Bay, and we were out there every weekend sandbagging all summer long. In the long run, it's best to work with Mother Nature if you can. And so what we're finding more and more is projects that feature what we call soft shoreline engineering, where we're using the less invasive and more nature-friendly techniques. Macomb County Parks has a master plan that includes, for instance, Ford's Cove and some other things up in the area of Metro Beach, or Lake Erie Metro Park, or Lake St. Clair Metro Park, rather. And you can see where they're using several things. They're restoring the wetlands that might have been allowed to erode away. Maybe put some barriers off that in front of that. So that's your artificial reefs and so on. And the marshlands here are absorbing the shock of waves just in the same way that the natural, wild rice beds did way back in the day. And so there are several things going on here at Ford's Cove that are demonstrating coastal restoration at the county level, and of course, restoring wetlands and so on. There's offshore barriers like those barges that we saw, the residents sinking up in Belvedere Bay. Then the Corps of Engineers, their coastal resilience study really has 4 types of strategies for making a coastline more resilient. And the traditional one is this coastal armoring, where you have these hard structures and seawalls and so on. But more and more, they are morphing towards non-structural solutions, which is to have sloping beaches, beach nourishment. I think you can see down at the bottom there where they'll bring in sand. If beaches wash away, they just keep hauling the sand back. A great deal of that is done over on Lake Michigan. And then really restoring natural environments like wetlands and so on. Again, we see the Corps talking about the same sort of thing that Macomb is doing up in Ford's Cove and Lake St. Clair Metro Park. And then finally, land use planning and setbacks, using zoning to say, hey, you can't build that close to the shoreline. You can't create an environment that is going to get wiped out every few years. This is something we're seeing down in the Gulf of Mexico and Florida and so on right now on a tragic scale. Sometimes you just have to say, let's let Mother Nature have the first quarter mile or so, right? And so more and more we're morphing from artificial towards natural options. And in doing so, moving from hard to soft surfaces, we're kind of looking back at the past. Remember, the indigenous period is characterized by using natural waterways, natural shorelines, which gave them natural resources, highly accessible and not being affected by water level changes, natural or otherwise. The colonial period, our French and our British, minimally modified the shoreline. They just made sure that they had places to launch and land their watercraft. As the watercraft, however, got bigger, they made greater demands on the shoreline. The restricted waterways, once they were unrestricted and took the limits off of vessel size and vessel accessibilities, then it leads to this current industrial period where we have a man-made environment, man-made waterways, and the hardened shorelines that we are seeing being more and more problematic. So our sustainable future may be to loop back to the naturalized and softened shorelines. Habitat restoration, which we see a lot of up in the St. Clair area, means that the flora and fauna are acting as not only as agents of change, but they're also acting as the beneficiaries. We're seeing more and more species return. There are beaver and mink and so on. There are bald eagles. They're reestablishing their ancestral habitats in these areas. And so not only are they making change, but they're actually benefiting. So what are the lessons of history that we're supposed to learn so that we don't repeat them? Well, at St. Felicity, that followed the French colonial model, the ribbon farm model, and with an unimproved shoreline with a shoal draft boat access. Belvedere followed the British colonial model, where they did periodically create wharves and warehouses and transshipment points, but otherwise unmodifying the shoreline, especially as habitation and agricultural development and so on pressed closer and closer to the shore. Neither of those models was prepared for the environmental changes that we created by not only being out of sync with natural rhythms, but also creating our own modifications. So as the landscape evolved, those two models really were inadequate to the demands of industrial navigation. So the fact that Lake St. Clair, unlike the other Great Lakes, can be modified by human activity to the extent that we've seen. I mean, we're not going to go out and change the shoreline of Lake Superior or Lake Huron in ways that we have been able to do with Lake St. Clair. I refer to it then as kind of the canary in the coal mine. This is the one that's the most sensitive in the Great Lakes system. And so it kind of gives us an idea of what we can and can't do and what we should, project in the future in order to, cope with this increasingly dynamic set of processes. These so-called natural processes are increasingly man-made. We not only have man-made landscapes now, we've got a man-made climate. We find that, storms and so on are getting more frequent and more powerful as more energy is pumped into the environment by our activities. And so here in the area of Southeast Michigan, Southwest Ontario, and the Lake St. Clair area, it shows us that we need to have sustainable infrastructure, sustainable environmental policies, because our shorelines are vulnerable. It's where we meet the water that sustains us and gives us our livelihood and our meaning and our identity. So we want to be able to mitigate the effects of flooding, erosion, industrial and agricultural pollution, the combined sewer outputs that can plague our area if our infrastructure isn't in sync with natural forces. Well, this is a little snapshot. Actually, it's a bit of an extension of the discussion that I had published earlier this year. Michigan's Venice is a big, long look, about nearly a 400-year look at this area through many perspectives, not only the shorelines, but talking about the shipbuilding industry. Before the session here, we were talking about how Mount Clemens was a hub of shipbuilding. All these shoreline communities had access to enormous stands of timber and so on. And so the key historical periods that we've seen here, the indigenous and then the various colonial and frontier and industrial and modern, all of these had their needs, their values, and left their mark on this environment. And to a large extent, it's still visible. It's visible archivally. It's visible in the oral history and the collective memories that we have of our forebears, but also it's out there in the archaeological record, where we can see how sail and steam and landscape modification evolved the landscape that we live in now. So with that, I will give you my thanks. And I thank the folks who have helped me in putting all this together and doing the ongoing research.